Welcome to our 2021 Consolidated Application Workshop. This is Bonnie McFarland, and I'm supported by our team here, Evan Bartelheim, Amy Tomamatsu, Ginny Keith, Adrian Balcazar, and Rachel Garcia. So we're here, and we're all here to support you, and thank heaven they're here. There are tech wizards too who got us switched over. We do apologize for the last minute change. We found that we had, because of the numbers, we were concerned we were going to exceed our availability for space in our typical system. And so at the last minute, and we had this happen previously, and we had people join at the last minute and bumped off people who were previously registered. So we didn't want that to happen. So appreciate your understanding on that. All right, so I guess it's the sign of the times, that a sign that there is hope and of normalcy on the horizon is that the ConApp is out and everything is pretty much normal with it and moving forward. So that's good. Oh, we can back up. We decided to provide today's workshop in two parts. And so the first part this morning is going to be an introduction. It's primarily for those of you who are new to the process, including some of you who may have completed the spring submission, but you haven't done the winter submission in the past, and also those of you who may be totally new to it, and this sort of got put on your plate and your what's the ConApp. And so that's what the first part is for. And if you have no experience or if you want to review, we're going to look at the purpose of the application, what the consolidated application is, where to find support materials, and how to use the consolidated application reporting system. And that's going to be about 45 minutes, and then we'll take a break. And after that, we'll begin a page-by-page review of the application, which will be more in-depth. As you'll see as we go through the application, we're going to look into some of the behind the scenes requirements and related requirements that will make it a smoother process for you. Sometimes when you get stuck and can't figure out why something isn't working, understanding the reasons behind that and what the purpose of the data collection is, what the rules associated with it are, can be very helpful, and it will make things a lot smoother. A lot of times those questions you'll end up answering yourself if you understand the process. All right, so let's now move ahead and take a look at the purpose of the consolidated application. And you do hear it called the ConApp lovingly, but the purpose is really, it's part of a two-part requirement for receipt of federal funds. The consolidated application and the local agency plan, which in California is the LCAP federal addendum, are both required for the receipt of ESSA formula grant funds. You're going to see, if you go to the Finance and Grants page on the CDE website, you'll find there two columns, one indicating whether or not the district or the LEA has submitted the consolidated application, and one indicating whether or not they've completed the federal addendum. So those are both required. If you don't see funding flowing to your district and you're eligible and you applied, it could be that your addendum wasn't completed or approved. So you need to connect with the department on that. So it is required as a receipt of the funding. It's primarily a fiscal reporting document, whereas the addendum has more of the narrative descriptions of the programs. But although it is a fiscal reporting document, it's based on program decisions. So once again, as we seem to say in so many cases, the collaboration between program and fiscal is critical. This is where you apply for and report on federal formula grants, and that includes Part A of Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV, also Part D of Title I. Those are all through the consolidated application. At this time, no state programs. There have been in the past state programs included, but currently there are no state programs included. Sometimes you'll find additional reporting included in the consolidated application. In the past, other reporting has been included there because almost all districts fill it out. But currently, it's very much specific to those four programs. All right, next slide. Just a little vocabulary here. You'll hear the term ConApp and you'll hear the term CARS. And just so it doesn't confuse you, the ConApp, or the Consolidated Application, is the application that you use to apply for federal funds. Whereas CARS is the Consolidated Application Reporting System. It's the system, and it's the web-based system used to apply for and collect the data. As primarily people use those terms interchangeably, but it's important when you're looking for questions where to look on the website. Is it an application question or is it a systems question? All right, next slide. Take a look at the consolidated application. It's submitted in two parts. The first part is in the spring, due on June 30th, and LEAs need to apply for funds in June, and that's when board approval is required. So when you apply for the funds, it's required that the local board approve it. At that time, you indicate which funds you wish to apply for. So you check off which funds are you interested. Also, you agree to adhering to the legal requirements for each of the programs, and we'll take a look at those in a bit. So it also includes some year-end reporting, such as a private school consultation and such, but primarily that's the first part of the submission, is you're requesting to apply for the funds, and there's some data reporting included in that. So look at the next slide, though, is part two, which we call is the winter submission. This is due typically on February 28th, comes out in January, and this is submitted in the winter. And if you didn't personally complete the spring submission, it's helpful to go back and take a look at what was submitted by your LEA. Some of the pages, excuse me, some of the pages submitted in the spring submission will have implications for what you report in the winter submission. Again, board approval typically only required unless there's some odd thing happen, and hopefully we're back to normal now, but board approval is only required for the spring submission because you need the board approval to apply for funds. Sometimes for some LEAs, the boards want to see, or your cabinet will say, we want to take it back to the board in the winter, and that's because you have final allocation numbers in there, and sometimes the board wants to see what those funding amounts are, but that's totally a local decision, not required by the state. Okay. Just a reminder on the winter submission is that this submission includes reporting on many decisions that needed to be made earlier in the year. One of the issues we see frequently is if someone is new or not familiar with the application, they think all of these things should be happening now. No, this is a report on what you've done earlier. This is not the time to be making decisions about school level funding, transfer of funds, because the school year is more than half over. So all these things should have been happening. So this is a reporting, it's not a decision-making time, and those decisions need to be made in a timely manner to support your schools, not as an after the fact. So keep that in mind as you're working on the application. All right, where to go for help? Next slide. For questions about CARS, again, that's the system, the web page, and it's accessible from the Consolidated Application web page. You click on another, and there's the CARS web page. The CARS web page includes several support documents that are helpful. One is called the CARS User Guide, and the User Guide, it actually walks you through step-by-step how to use and access the Consolidated Application Reporting System. So it's a step-by-step manual. You'll notice it's the date on it is rather old, and that's because the system really hasn't changed for a number of years. It's pretty stable. So if you've used it before, no surprises, but if you haven't, the user guide is very helpful. In addition, there is a webinar posted on the CD website. It's Navigating CARS webinar, and it's again a step-by-step walkthrough how to access the system, how to submit the various documents, and highly recommend it because it is slow and it's not exciting television watching. However, you can fast forward it, and if you want to, let me see that again, you can go there. The other support is the ConApp support desk. And the ConApp support desk is there to answer questions about the system. So they aren't there to answer program issues. They can answer, though, systems issues. If the system isn't working for you, they're the people to contact. Now, in addition, you'll see other program contacts. And in some cases, you'll see both a program and a fiscal contact listed on the page. Each page has contact information. That's how you should contact about questions about that particular data collection. So if it's a fiscal related question, and it's just about the dollars and how you report that, if there's a fiscal contact, they're your best person. But if it's about allowability and program requirements, then you need to talk to the program person. Okay? If you need to reopen an old data collection, and we'll hit that in one of our later pieces where that may come up, you need to contact the ConApp support desk. However, they may refer you back to a program person if there's a requirement of some sort for you to get approval for that. Okay. And then also we'll look at the program guidance and instructions. They're also very helpful. All right, let's look at what's changed this year. And some of the changes for this year are based on the federal flexibility waivers from the U.S. Department of Education. Two primary ones were the extension of the availability of 2018-19 funds and the authority that CDE had to approve waivers for excess Title I carryover. So you'll see those changes reflected on those pages. Another significant change was that the private school reporting was moved from the spring submission to this submission, and that's reporting on the numbers of participating in which schools will be participating. And the reason for that was they found frequently that by this time of year things had changed, schools had closed, and are always having to go back to the prior submission and make changes. So that should be helpful. You're reporting on your private school participation now. And some pages were also made so information that's not applicable to a particular LEA is not going to show up in your reporting. So they've adjusted some of the pages. So some helpful changes. Some additional changes, again, these are all, again, related private school participation and some of the waivers for various programs. So primarily those are the key areas of change. So let's look at how you get connected, okay? Again, first of all, you need to sign up for the ConApp listserv. If you received notification in January that the system was open, then you're on the listserv. If you didn't receive that notification, then you need to sign up for the listserv. If anything happens or changes occur, that's how will notify you. You need to also register in the CAS, which is the centralized authenticating system, to be able to enter the CARS system. And the LEA user guide answers questions about CAS, but essentially you'll go to the CDE website, you'll go, and you can find a link to CAS on the ConApp website, and you will you'll enter a username and password, and that will be the username and password you use for CARS. It's also used for FPM, so it's sort of your gateway to all your CDE reporting. And this on the next slide is kind of a picture of what it will look like when you go to enter. Again, you set up your username in CAS, you'll enter your username and password, and then then it will open up the next page. And make sure your password is up to date. Sometimes it's out of date periodically. You have to update it. You may have to reset it. So make sure all that's working. Hopefully it's working by now. I know that some of you are already on your way to completing the application, but if you haven't started, make sure you can get in and your password is current. All right, and then when you enter the system, this is what you'll see. And sorry, this is an old one. It will be current, all right, but this is essentially, it will look just like this. It'll have your district, and what you will see, it will open up to the home page, and the home page is going to show those data collections specific to your LEA. So if you're not participating in a program or something isn't applicable to you, it won't be showing up on your page. So only those data submissions that you have. Then you'll find the other tabs. There's a certification preview, and it will show you the status of each report. And if you want to print a document, you can go to the reports tab. So different tabs have different functions, but the home tab will show you all your required data collections. All right, so what the data collections, when you complete your data collections, just recommended that you complete the data collections in the order in which they appear on the home page from the top down. The reason for that is some collections are what they call data dependent. A data dependent page means that you can't complete the information on one page without entering information on a previous page. And those two pages interact with each other. So if you change it on one page, you have to change it on the other. So that's why if you put them in order, it generally works best. If you try and go into a data collection and you can't complete it, it may be because it's dependent on a prior page. Make sure to hit save when you complete the page. And if you go back to a page that you previously certified, and now you made a change on a page that's dependent on that page, you're going to have to change both pages to make sure they match. Okay. And you can work from, there's a home screen and a data entry screen that's available. Okay. All right, let's take a look at, I mentioned that you can see the status of your of each of the collections in the preview page, and it may say none, and that means nobody started on it. And this is helpful, especially when you have multiple people working on the application at the same time. You can see the status of it. Has anyone started on this or haven't they? Okay. So if it says none, that means nobody's started yet. Okay. If it says draft, that means someone's been in there and somebody started, but it's not completed. If it's certified, then someone's completed, it's certified, and only certain people have the ability to certify. We'll take a look at that in a minute. The last one is called certified obsolete. And what this means refers to data dependency. So that means a page was certified, but then you change something that now is going to require you to go back and change the other page. So the page was certified, but it's no longer appropriately certified. That certification is obsolete because you made a change on a dependent page. Okay, so that's, if you see certified obsolete, you need to determine, okay, what other page is connected to this one, and go back and fix that one too. Right, there are various types of data that you'll see. Some data will be automatically populated in there, and they have something called displayed data. And displayed data is calculated often within a submission. So you put something, you put some numbers in, and it automatically calculates something further down on the page. It could be it's displayed from another collection within the ConApp. So you'll see some data that's popped over from at least one page. We know we have data popped over from a spring submission. So sometimes it's not even within that, it's within the ConApp. And then there's data from an outside source that can't be edited. That would be like your allocation. You can't go in and change that. That is what it is. So, okay. So there are some you can't change. Then there's pre-populated data that's brought forth from another data collection again. And then there's the data dependency we talked about, when pre-populated data has to be changed based on another data collection. So you'll see various kinds of data that pops up. And the important thing is to know where it comes from, because that can be confusing. You're trying to complete a page and a number doesn't look right to you, and you need to know where it came from. Is it something that you entered previously? Or is it something that CDE entered from data that they have? And is it something that can be changed or can't be changed? All right, certifying reports. You have an option. You can certify after you complete each report, or you can wait till the end and certify them all at once. Once it's certified, you can make changes and recertify as long as the system is open. And the system is open. It's sort of a secret, but the system, we don't know how long the system's open, okay? But generally, sometimes the system remains open and you can fix something, but don't count on it. Use that February 28th as your final deadline. But sometimes you can access prior submissions. Other times you have to contact CDE to open a page for you. All right. So let's talk about warnings. All right. There are a couple kinds of warnings that you may get on a page, and you'll find in the instructions. The instructions are incredibly helpful because they'll tell you exactly what the issue is if you have a warning or an error and what you need to do to correct it. So let's take a look first at the warning. A warning is a message that there's a possible problem on that page. Okay, there is either you've broken a business rule or there's a dependency that exists, something that you need to be aware of. You can certify with a warning, but you should know what that warning means. You should know what it is, and you should know, no, it's okay. I understand it, and I know what the issue is. If you don't know what the issue is, you need to look into that a little bit more. Read the instructions and see what the possible problem is. But you can still certify with a warning. It's just kind of telling you this doesn't look right according to the rules. Something's wrong here. It's not necessarily wrong. You may have a reason for it, but we're alerting you. Then there's something that this isn't real, but previous lady at CDE used this and I thought it was great. She called it a warning. There are warnings that will say something like, you may be contacted by CDE, or this may trigger a question. So those are a little bit higher stakes warnings. Okay, so these are something that is probably maybe, and this has to do sometimes with your administrative costs and some caps on that. And if they're not legislated, CDE may say, well, you might be able to do that, but we need to talk to you about it. So if you see that, it's kind of a red flag that I think maybe I need to look at this again. Now, the last kind of message you get is an error. Error messages are different from warnings. They are definitely something is not allowable that you've put in there. You need to correct it. You cannot certify the page without correcting the error message. So errors stop you from certifying. Warnings warn you that something doesn't seem right here, and you may get a call on it. All right, comment boxes. In this application, there really aren't any other than the Title I carryover page, and it's a required comment box, but just for future reference, sometimes there are comment boxes, and in those cases, it may be if you have a warning message, that would be a place to indicate, why whatever you're submitting is appropriate. But in this case, we don't see any comment boxes, but just know that can be a possibility. All right, now let's move to the user roles. Because the users have various roles, and someone is going to be the decider, and that may be you, of who needs to have which role. First of all, there's the LEA, and again, you see the note, the user guide has a lot more detail on this, and this actually comes from the user guide. But the LEA authorized representative is either the superintendent or their designee. So in a lot of cases, you become the designee. And that means that is the person who's responsible for certifying legal assurances. They're responsible for certifying the page submissions, that they have the ability to do just about everything in the system, but they're the final ones. They would be the ones who you would have that can click on the legal assurances. You have to have a signature from the superintendent, but the LEA authorized representative basically has overall authority over making those decisions. The next role is and I call these the worker bees, the LEA data entry representative. This is the user who has the ability to enter data, to save data. They are the ones who are doing all the work. So you need to determine who are the people in your LEA who are going to need your problem. You're going to have some fiscal people, you have program people, you have people, if you have a large LEA, you may have people responsible for different programs who are doing different parts. So you need to make that decision as to who are all the people who are going to be entering data, okay? And they can view it, they can view data, they can enter it, but they don't certify the data. Right? The next one is LEA, general staff, and this is for people who you actually don't want touching the data, right? This is a safe space if you have people who you want to view the data, and that can be people like us, your county office staff or other support people who may be, you may be asking for help. It's easier if we can actually see what's going on in your application. And if you provide LEA general staff, then that person can view what's in there, but they can't touch it, they can't edit it, they can't mess up your data, so to speak. All right. So the LEA general staff is a place for particularly support people to be able to view your data. So that's a helpful one. And then finally, I'm guessing many of you on this call would be the person who's the LEA user administrator. And that's the person who makes decisions about managing access to the roles. So that's the person who is determining all these roles, who has which roles. So if you want to give someone access, it's the LEA user administrator who would do that. Okay. And again, refer to the CARS user guide on the CDE website. We'll go into depth on each of those roles. All right, so let's take a look at the main page. This is the to find the ConApp page. If you haven't gotten there yet, it's a very helpful page. You need to go to Finance and Grants from the main page on CDE website, and then you're going to click on the consolidated application, and that will take you to the main page. And the main page, you can see up at the top, there are links. There's links to CARS, there's links to FAQs, communications that have come out. But you'll find, particularly at the top, you'll find the instructions and the guidance. The instructions are different from the guidance. The instructions are the step-by-step review of the submission requirements. So what do you put on each line? So that's the instructions. I generally have them downloaded. They're also accessible in an online format. So those are helpful. The guidance provides more general legal requirements for specific programs, particularly those that might have been problematic. The request for applications is where you go to find the legal assurances listed. So let's take a look a little more in depth in the next slide at some of those. And just again, the program guidance, each year it's a little different, but this year it reviews Title III, English Learner, and immigrant programs, and it provides guidance on allowable costs for those programs. It also describes a federal transferability and gives some information on that. And finally, it addresses Title II and how Title II funding allocations are developed. So that's the guidance. It's a rather short document, but if you want information on those topics, that's where to find it. The next is the instructions. And as I said, the instructions are invaluable. A step-by-step guide. You'll find references in the instructions on today's slide. So as we go through the page by page that will start on the next session, you'll find at the top, we give you the page references in the instructions for that. The instructions also, they're helpful because they're available in two formats. So if you're a paper person, then you can download it in Word. If you like to highlight and underline and have them, that's very handy. But they're also accessible in an online format. And when you go to the online format, you'll see all the pages listed. And when you click on a page, it takes you directly to the instructions for that page. So whatever is your preference for working, either online or on, having a document that you can hang on to, either way, they're both available to you. And then also we'll look a little bit more at the legal assurances, but in just a minute, but those are the federal and state requirements that your LEA has agreed to as a condition of receiving the funds. And there's a link to those on that website too. All right, next we will look at some more valuable information on that page. CARS news flash updates. Fortunately, the system's been working so well, we don't see as many of them, but there was a flash update. There's only one so far, and it reviewed all the changes for this year's application. But the flash updates go out to the listserv, and then they're also provided on the website. And then there is a data collection release schedule that's periodically updated, and it gives you a list of all the upcoming data collections that are going to be required. All right, some more on the next page, program profiles. Program profiles are, they're generally, you find them under the fiscal side and under the finance and grants. But the program profiles are descriptions of programs. Really, they talk about whatever. If you're not familiar with a particular program, it goes in, it gives you just a brief summary of what it is, what the funding is, who's eligible, and some program contacts. There's also a list of CDE program contacts. So on each page, you'll have program contacts specific to that particular page submission, but there's also a link that gives you a full list of all the page program contacts. And then the link to the listserv is also on the web page. All right, so we mentioned legal assurances, yes. So somebody agreed to some things in your LEA, and it's important for you to know what those are. So in an effort of no surprises. So in the spring, your superintendent or your charter school administrator had to agree to specific assurances that they would abide by in turn for receiving federal funds. And these form the basis of FPM, Federal Program Monitoring. While neither FPM nor the assurances are a total comprehensive list, they do cross over. So you'll see many of the requirements in your FPM monitoring instrument are also things that you agreed to. So when the FPM monitor calls you out on something, you say, I didn't know we had to do that. Well, that's where it might have come from, that somebody signed an assurance that you would do that. These are also assurances that would be reviewed through the federal audit process too. So let's take just a quick look at some of those assurances. And this is this is from the page, and here's a list of all the assurances. And these are not all the assurances. These are the general areas in which you'll find the assurances. So let's look is on that page, and what you'll see on the next slide is what the agency received, and it says the applicant agency by signature of its authorized representative, district superintendent or designee, and again, you need to have that on a hard copy signature and maintain it on file. On the first page of the ConApp, hereby assures the California State Board of Education, the agency will adhere to the following legal assurances. So that's a signature required on the spring submission, and that's a legally binding assurance that your LEA has given the department that they will follow the rules in the assurances. So the next slide gives just another perhaps easier to read list of all the assurances. And you can see there are general assurances. There are assurances related to the LEA plan, or that's the LCAP federal addendum. There are several Title I specific requirements and assurances. Also, you find them for Title II and III, number of programs for English learner, and then Title IV. So some are program specific and some are more general in nature. And the general assurances, you can see they cover a wide variety of areas, but as you can see, some of them address things like civil rights and non-discrimination requirements, the uniform complaint process, and equitably allocating categorical funds. So these are assurances that apply to all the programs. They're general assurances. And the last one you'll see is an annual evaluation. And that's one that frequently gets missed. So let's just take a look to see what you agreed to. Again, you agreed to General Assurance 21 says that results of an annual evaluation will demonstrate the LEA and each participating school are implementing consolidated programs that are not of low effectiveness, under criteria established by the local governing board. So the question for you, given that, is, has your board established such criteria? And if it has, where would you find that if you were asked to locate it? What's the annual process for demonstrating that programs are meeting the effectiveness criteria? So that's just one little example of what's in the assurances. So it behooves you to look at those and be aware of them. And because chances are you're the lucky person that will get asked if someone has a question about any of them. All right, the next page is shows you, whoops, documentation. Yes, you have to, you're required to print the certified copy of the spring ConApp with the certification of assurances. A signed hard copy needs to be available. So that's another little task to go find out if you're new, where is that and where could you put your hands on it if you were reviewed and asked to provide it. Where you'll find the assurances is on the request for application page, and you can see down at the bottom, it says legal assurances, and when you click on that, that's where you'll find all those assurances if you want to take a look at all of them. All right, we're getting close here. All right, CARS webpage. Again, this is, remember we said the CARS webpage is separate but linked to the consolidated application. This is all about the system. So this is where you can register for the centralized authentication system, or CAS, if you weren't already registered. This is where you can log in to access your ConApp reporting system. And this is where you also find a data release calendar. So check there for periodically. So that's what you'll find, some major things on the CARS website, but that's how you can access the system. All right, and training and user documents. Some other things you'll find are the ConApp frequently asked questions. Again, helpful. A process to follow if you forget your passwords. I told you everything is on this page. And then you also, your user guide, I've mentioned that a number of times. So yeah, the CARS webpage, a lot of support and training materials. Okay, other useful links and resources are the application for a county district code, a CDS code. If you have a school that is new or has changed their grade span, something that has changed with the school, essentially, you need to go in and change that information on the online public update for schools Opus before it will pop into the ConApp. So if you're seeing a school that is incorrectly identified in terms of their grade span or who they're serving, or a new school that's added on, you need to find who in your district is the person who has access to the Opus system, and that needs to be changed prior to making that change in the ConApp. So if you're anticipating any changes for the coming year, it's good to know that needs to take place. Once you do that, those schools will show up correctly in your ConApp in the spring. Okay. And then the California School Directory just gives you a directory of schools, but another helpful link there. Right, so that brings us, I think, to the end of part 2. Amy, were there any questions in there that we can address now before we take a break?
Hello. Yes, there is one question. I was trying to answer some questions in the chat as we went along. So, but one question I didn't quite get to is what ConApp information do you recommend sharing with DLAC families?
Oh, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking. The DLAC has been has been a source of confusion because there is a signature on the spring submission that says essentially the DLAC has reviewed the ConApp. And so that's exactly the question. Oh, what do I review? And the guidance we've received from the department, and previously there was a letter on it that was since been pulled back, but I think the guidance still sort of holds, is that the DLAC should be part of your development of programs impacting English learners throughout the course of the year. So it's not just, here's the ConApp, look at it, and does it make sense? But you might have throughout the year, when you have a DLAC meeting, I suggest that you have it in your minutes, that you're reviewing various programs and how those will be addressed in the ConApp in the coming year. So as you meet with your DLAC, what are you looking at for your EL programs? How might Title I services be supporting English learners, talking with them, getting input, and then documenting that, and then asking your either DLAC president or representative. They would need to sign that, and their signature essentially means that they've had an opportunity to understand and review and perhaps have input into those programs. So that I believe is sort of the last reasonable kind of guidance that we've gotten from the department on that. So good question. All right.
Thank you, Bonnie. And a follow-up to that just popped up. Does the DLAC approve the spring or fall ConApps?
Spring. It's in the spring submission. There's a place for the DLAC signature. And then if they don't sign, then there's a comment place, I believe, where you can comment on the reason for not signing. But yes, that's on the same thing. You have board approval. You also have the DLAC on the spring. It's on the cover page on the spring submission.
Thank you. If there's any additional questions, please go ahead and post those to the chat. All the questions, even those that were answered in the chat, will be appearing in our follow-up Q&A document. I know that many of you are probably focused on Bonnie's presentation and not reading the questions and answers appearing in the chat, but they may be good information to have. So we'll go ahead and have all of the answered and unanswered questions in our follow-up chat.
Absolutely. Thanks, Amy. Yes, those of you who've had meetings with us before know that's kind of how we work, because some of your questions are really hard and some of them take a lot of time to research too. So please enter your questions in the chat. We will research it and send it out to all participants and our state and federal directors group. Okay. All right, so we're pretty close to being on time. We're going to take a brief 10-minute break, give you a chance to stretch, be ready for the next one, because the next one is the page by page, and that will be from 10 to 11:30. So get some water and relax and stretch, and we'll be back at 10 o'clock. Reports, and because the funds would have expired by last September, but the federal flexibility waiver extended that timeline, and we'll take a look at that and how that impacts those reports in a minute. So 18-19, then you have 19-20 reporting, and that's going to include your Title I carryover and your EL and immigrant. They have 18-month. You'll find the EL and immigrant programs have more fiscal reporting than some of the others. And I have a hunch that's because sometimes those funds don't get spent in a timely manner. So they ask for frequent reporting on it. All right, then on the next slide, we're looking at the 2021, and 2021 reports include the most data collections, and that's primarily because of Title I reporting. There's multiple reports related to reporting for equitable services requirements and also for school allocations. So you'll see a lot of Title I reporting in there. So 2021 is going to be the biggest chunk of your work, and it actually even goes on to the next page, and you can see all the other programs on the next slide, all the Title II, and again, EL, immigrant. You'll notice there are two collectors. There's going to be for each program, there's a Title III English learner and there's a Title III immigrant. So again, you will only see on your home page those data collections that apply for LEA. So if you don't receive a funding source, like not all districts get immigrant funding, then you would not be reporting on it. So it could considerably less depending on that. And the next slide just gives you a more, next two slides actually give you more detail, so you can see how many collections are in there. It's this slide. And then the next, it's a lot of data collections. But again, you're not going to see those likely on your main screen unless you get all those funding sources. And a few of you do. So it is possible that you could have them all, but not likely. All right, so let's look at 1819. All right, so we're going to start out with 1819 data collections. And again, as I said, these would typically be closeout reports because the funds expired on September 30th of 2020. And now for this year, this is an exception. And we'll take a look at how that impacts the reports. But first, let's take a look at why they would have initially and why we expired and why we need that flexibility. So on the next slide, you'll see an overview of the federal funding cycle. And if you're new to federal programs, I haven't worked with them, that federal formula grants are typically available to LEAs for 27 months. So you have a considerable amount of time to spend those funds. But once it's over, unlike most state funds that you can just continue carrying over. You have them available for there's two reasons. First, there's what's called forward funding. Congress is supposed to pass a budget like in October, usually it's around December, but those funds that are passed in the fall of the year aren't available to LEAs until the following June. So the clock doesn't start ticking until then. And this helps us a lot because sometimes you hear when the budget is late getting passed and they talk about various agencies being closed down and federal programs and why doesn't that affect education? That's because that our funding doesn't come until June, so we're operating on prior allocations. So that's one thing that helps us. Then we have something called the Tidings Amendment, which allowed school districts, they said, well, they don't get these funds till June and a year. Let's give them another year to spend those funds. So we get them in June. They'll both tell the next June and then one additional year. So that's 24 months. Okay? So those 2018-19 funds, you got them in July 1, 2018. You got them for an additional year, which made it through June 30th of 2020. And then you get an additional 3 months because the federal fiscal year ends on September 30th versus the state programs end on June 30th. So that's how you get to 27 months. So unfortunately, there were still some LEAs that had funds, and with school closures, they weren't able to spend the funds. And typically they would have been invoiced by CDE for those funds, okay? The next slide just provides another picture of that if you're a visual person, how that funds work. So on the next page, we'll see what would have been closeout reports. And some of them still use the term closeout reports. But the closeout reports would have meant that you had to obligate those funds by September 30th. However, what happened is the flexibility waiver. So on the next slide, look at what that did for us. The federal flexibility waiver was last April. U.S. Department of Education granted a waiver, and they offered the opportunity for states to apply, and California did apply for a waiver to extend the period of availability for 2018-19 carryover funds for an additional year. So now any LEA, and many of you have already spent those funds, you spent them in and that's fine, that's good. But if you didn't and you still had some remaining, you have through September 30th of 2021, okay, and to spend those funds. And so you will need to continue to report on those funds, but CDE will not invoice LEAs for 18-19 carryover funds until after the close of the 21-22 winter release. So that's targeted for next January. So it'd be a year from now that you'll be reporting on them, but they need to be expended by September 2021. Oops. 2021, yes, it is. Okay, I've lost track of what year we're in now. Can't be 2021, it is. All right, so, but one caution, and the reason I wanted to mention this is something that you might be aware of if you do have carryover funds. On the next slide, there's just a little caution note here. The period of availability for your 1920 funds is also currently September 30th, 2021. So unless the U.S. Department of Education offers a waiver extending the timeline for 1920 funds, those funds would need to be obligated by the same date. So you would have 2 years worth of funds coming due at the same time. It's possible a waiver could come through, but no, there's nothing yet. So no waivers currently available. So we're just suggesting that you keep that. If you do have, if you had 18-19 carryover funds, that probably means you haven't been spending those funds in a particularly timely manner. And if that's now, you have a backup of 2 years worth of funds. You don't want to lose those funds next September. So you need to put that into your planning, work with your schools and get those funds spent. All right. If you want to know on the next slide, how do I know how much I'm spending? I think I know, but one place to go is to the CDE website, and you will see, you can find your current expenditures that are reported as per the California Department of Education. And this is based on the federal cash management reporting. So if you go to finance and grants on the main website, look at back up. Yeah, go up at the top, you'll say go to finance and grants, then you go to categorical programs, and then you'll find a list of all the programs. You go to the program, this one is Title I Part A, and you can find a list, you'll find all the prior years. So you can choose a year. You can look at 18-19, 19-20, whatever year you want to look at, and you'll find an Excel spreadsheet listing all the LEAs in the state. And you'll see on there a column saying, is your CARS application complete? So did you submit your ConApp? Your federal addendum, is it submitted and approved? The next line will show your allocation. It says revise. Those keep getting updated for lots of magical reasons, but your allocation is listed there, how much you should receive. Now, the next few columns will show how much you have been receiving. So you can see, have the payments been coming on a regular basis? And in some cases, you'll see a lot of zeros there. And that means those funds haven't been coming to you because probably you're not reporting them in the federal cash management system. And the last column will show the balance remaining. If the balance you see remaining, if that doesn't make sense to you, then you need to talk to your fiscal people and see, are you reporting in the cash management system so CDE can see that we're spending down our funds so we'll get our next allocation. So you can actually go in and see. It's a very handy, useful place to go to check how your spending is going, and is it matching what you report in the ConApp should kind of match what you're seeing in the federal cash management and what you're seeing from CDE has. So a handy place to look if you're like, I'm new, I have no idea how much money we have left. Check your 1920 and see if you're on target to spend that money. Okay. All right, so then the next page is, I think, the first page of the report. And this is, and again, you'll see it says closeout report, but sort of closed out, but you still have that waiver. So there's going to be two possible forms that you'll see. And again, the nice thing is you don't have to choose the form. It will pop up the one that fits your district. But one, if your LEA had any 18-19 carryover reported, then you're going to have a longer form. If you didn't have any previous carryover, then you'll have a shorter form. So that's kind of the difference there. You're going to include any funds expended, the 18-19, your total funds expended, and then determine if there's any carryover remaining. And in this case, the carryover will not be invoiced until, and you have until the September 30th, 2021 to carry those funds over. So this would typically be a closeout report. You'd be invoiced. This year you won't. Okay. So that's the Title I closeout report. And next is the, okay, next slide. There, okay. Title I Part D, okay, and this is interesting. Title I Part D is county offices only, although we did have previously other LEAs, well, LAUSD did receive the funds, but primarily this is county office. Part D is for delinquent programs. These are primarily our students who are in institutions for delinquent youth. So most of you will not be having, this won't show up for you. You won't have to submit it. However, we did notice on that page, and we checked with the program office, and according to them, the federal flexibility waiver, they are saying, is not applicable to Part D funds. So you would be invoiced for any unspent funds. I did a quick check, and it looks like most counties have spent those funds, but you might want to talk to that program office if there's a problem there. But it sounds like if you exceeded, you still have carryover funds as of September 30th of last year. If your Part D funds, you would be invoiced. Again, we mentioned warning messages, and this page has a warning message. If your total administrative costs exceed 15%, Part D has 15%. It doesn't have a legislative cap, and that's why it's not an error message. It's a warning message. Okay, so they're saying it should be, and we'll look at how that works in a minute. But essentially, because there's no legislative cap, but CDE uses a reasonableness test, and they're saying if it's over 15%, then you need to think about, are your administrative costs too high? So Part D won't apply to most of you. The next one is also good news to many of you. There's no Title II Part A report this year. So your Title II funds, you don't have to report for 18-19. Again, keep in mind, you have until next September to spend those funds. All right. All right, the next one is your Title III English learner data collection. And you will have pre-populated data in here, the 18-19 allocation. So how much you received for the year, that's going to be populated for you. And then the amount transferred in, because you can transfer funds through federal transferability. So if in 18-19 you transferred funds in, those will show up there. And we'll talk about this again later, but for Title III, you can only transfer funds in, not out. So it would only show funds transferred in. Your expenditures are going to be for the full period of the grant to date. So it would be through July 1st of 2018, and you're reporting through September 30th of 2020, which would have been the date that those would have expired. And there's a note on there, and I'm not sure I found on the EL one, but that if you have employee costs, then you have to have benefit costs. You can't have benefits without employee costs. So just know that that's going to be a warning message. You will get an error message on this one. This is the first one we've seen that has an error message. And that's because Title III has a direct administrative cost cap of 2%. So for direct administrative costs, you can't exceed 2% of the allocation plus your transfers in. So you cannot certify, that needs to be reduced. Now, Title III also allows, and this was a change under ESSA, so I think we're kind of all caught up with it now, but you can apply your full approved indirect cost rate to the amount not reserved for administrative costs. So you can apply the indirect cost rate, but only 2% for direct administrative costs. And we'll look at that in just a minute to see what the difference is. Right, and again, you won't be invoiced for any remaining funds, but you have until next September to spend them. The next collection is Title III immigrant funds. And again, same thing, they'll indicate what your allocation was for 18-19, what your any funds that were transferred in, because again, Title III immigrant, you can only transfer funds in, not out. And this one, you would get a warning message. Notice the difference. There was an error message on Title III English learners that had to do with administrative costs, and a warning message. And the warning message is because CDE says that your direct administrative costs should not exceed 2%. Okay, for Title III EL, they must not exceed. And that's because that's in legislation. There's not a legislated cap on Title III immigrant, but CDE uses the reasonableness test, and presuming that if that's what you're using for your EL, it should not exceed 2% for administrative costs. Again, you can certify because it's just a warning, but you may anticipate a question on that if you exceed the 2%. Okay. And again, you can apply the full indirect cost rate to the part not reserved for direct administration. And once again, though, a period of availability is extended to next September. When you fill in the amounts, the expenditure amounts, and they're by object codes here, by general object codes, and then when you hit recalculate, it will show the amount that is remaining. Okay? And remember to save the page, okay, before you go on. All right. Now we've talked about some things on the last 2 pages that are a source of confusion sometimes. So let's take a look at some of those, the terminology and how these are different and how they apply. And so the terms, they aren't new, but under ESSA, there were some changes that made some of these terms more critical to understand, because actually they changed one word in the legislation, and it had significant changes in terms of your fiscal requirements and your allowability for administrative costs. So let's take a look at the words that are challenging. First, we have administrative costs. There are 2 types of administrative costs, and we just saw those. One is for direct program administration. So those are direct services supporting the program, but they're administrative in nature. The others are indirect cost, which is determined by your indirect cost rate. And those are, by definition, not direct. They are indirect. They're not something tangible that you can say, like a direct program administrative cost. This, again, this became important under ESSA. So let's take a look at the next slide, because there's a term, what's a direct cost, okay? So direct costs are those that can be identified specifically with a particular cost objective, and they can be directly assigned to a cost. Note, it's not about the nature of the cost, like an instructional assistant. That doesn't make it a direct cost or not. What's that instructional assistant doing? And they can be directly attributed to the program if their services are directly assigned and supportive of the program. So it's not what the name of it is. So sometimes we'll get questions. Well, can I hire a resource teacher? Well, it depends. What's the nature of their work? Can I hire an instructional assistant under this program? What's the nature of their work? To be a direct cost, it has to do with the nature of the work. Okay. Now, direct costs can be of 2 kinds. They can be for direct services. Those are services for students, usually at school sites, and they do include things like parent involvement and professional development, but they're directly serving students. Whereas direct administrative costs, which is what we're looking at, are direct services. They directly support the program, but they're direct costs. I'm sorry. They directly support the program, but they're not a direct student service. They're at a direct administrative cost. All right. Now, next we'll look at indirect costs. And indirect costs are those agency-wide costs that they're more general in nature. They're more they're necessary for the general operation. They support the program, but you can't identify, lights, air conditioning, those kind of things. You can't directly attribute it to a particular program. However, some things to remember, and that's why we have an indirect cost rate. So LEAs don't have to figure out how those costs apply. The thing to remember is that an indirect cost you can apply something as a direct cost and an indirect cost, okay? And if it's either one or the other. And sometimes you need to look at how are we defining indirect costs? What do we consider as indirect costs? And you can have a finding if you charge a categorical program, a federal program, for a cost, as a direct cost, and you also charge it as, you also consider it as an indirect cost for other programs. So important to know and think about what does your LEA consider as included in indirect costs? Are you charging for space? What is it that's indirect and included there? And make sure you aren't double dipping. And we know this, we had a program, personal experience with the program that got called on that because they were charging something as an indirect cost. That's how it was included. And then they had a charge for it as a direct cost also. So let's look at the term administrative costs. So administrative costs can be direct or indirect costs. Okay, so direct administrative costs are those that are directly supporting the program, and then your indirect costs are also considered administrative in nature. Now, before ESSA, most programs included administrative costs. They included both direct and indirect costs. This was a lump. Okay, it was indirect, direct costs. That's what determined your administrative cost cap. However, under ESSA, for some programs that changed, and I said one little word, and the word was direct. When they included the word direct administration, and that you'll see that in several of the programs, then that meant that your direct administrative costs had a cap, but your indirect costs did not have that same cap. So under ESSA, things changed, and that's what caused some confusion. So when you fill out these forms, you're going to see some forms where you have a total administrative cap for both your direct administration and like Title I and indirect, and others you're going to see where you have a cap only on direct administration. Used to be more simple. Now it's gotten a little confusing. All right. Also, to add to that, the uniform guidance, which was updated back in 2015, and we keep reminding people of this because it actually tightened the criteria for what are allowable for administrative costs, for direct administrative costs. And this was new. They said that salaries of administrative or clerical staff should normally be treated as an indirect cost. So typically administration, secretaries, that should all be normally treated as an indirect cost. They can be charged as a direct cost if any of the following. So you have to demonstrate the services are integral to a project or activity. In other words, what they're doing is so important to that activity, it wouldn't be happening without them. The individuals are specifically identified with the project or activity. So what is that secretary doing that's actually supporting that? Or are they just in the office doing general clerical stuff? Okay. The costs are explicitly included in the budget. So your program budget needs to identify those individuals. And again, as we said, the costs aren't also included as an indirect cost. So you can see that we've gotten a little bit tighter, and that also goes to the fact that that's loosened up for districts. Now they can charge their full indirect cost on some programs, but what is a direct cost has gotten tighter based on the Uniform Grants Guidance. So just something to keep in mind there. And how are you ensuring that your administrative staff meets this criteria? So just to kind of summarize, I think the next little visual kind of gives a view of what it looked like. So indirect costs, usually they've been a subset of administrative costs. So again, Title I, you have a 15% administrative cap, and that includes direct administration and indirect costs, all 15%. Title III, EL, on the other hand, has a cap only on direct administration, and you can charge your full indirect costs. So these are going to play out as you complete the most of the forms, the expenditure forms. All right. So some examples, and we just kind of said this on the next slide. Title I, 15% includes both. That's on the next slide. And then Title III has a 2% cap on direct administration, but your full indirect cost rate. Now you saw one that you got a warning on. Like, what's that about? It was sort of in the middle. And remember, I mentioned reasonableness. So if a federal program such as Title II Title II doesn't have a legislative cost cap, but CDE applies a reasonableness, and the reasonableness test comes from the federal cost principles: reasonable, necessary, and allocable. And that reasonableness test is what they use. They're saying if we say 15% appears to be a reasonable cost for administration, there's no legislation that says it can't be more, but you need to make a case for reasonableness. And so you can expect to be contacted if it doesn't meet that reasonableness test. And that's why you get a warning and not an error. All right. Okay. And where did that come from? On the next slide, I think we look at, it comes from the federal cost principles, and that's in the Uniform Grants Guidance. They didn't make it up. Okay. On the next slide, you'll see the factors that affect allowability. And three of the top ones are that any cost must be reasonable, necessary, and allocable. So for your administrative costs they need to be reasonable. Does that make sense? That's an amount. Necessary was the secretary's example. And allocable, can you show that it supports the program? And the next slide just shows the other factors we won't go into today, but there are other factors affecting allowability. I just wanted to say that's where that comes from. So how does this apply to administrative cost caps? Again, as we said, CDE presumes 15% is reasonable, and that's what they're going to do for direct administration and indirect. You get a warning. Title III, it's in legislation, but for Title III immigrant, there is no legislative cap, but they're suggesting that 2% is reasonable since it should align to your EL programs. All right, and California School Accounting Manual also, whoops, did we skip a slide? Oh no, there it is. So this is from the California School Accounting Manual, and this is just something for you to keep in mind in terms of budgeting, because if you have a cap on administrative costs, say a program has a 15% cap, like Title I, on both direct and indirect costs, if your district's or your LEA's indirect cost rate goes up, then that lowers the amount you have available to provide a direct administrative support to the program. So this directly affects you and your job and your people in your office. So you need to check indirect cost rates annually to make sure that you have enough money to operate the program within the administrative cap. All right, so that, and just wanted to, because that's going to pop up a lot in the upcoming slides. So we just wanted to make sure we won't have to say it for each slide. We've said it once. Any questions so far, Amy, that haven't been? I know the chat's you've been answering a lot.
Yes, there's a number of questions. I have a few about like administrative costs, direct administrative costs. So I kind of have three in that same family. The first one says, is it true that administrative costs cannot exceed 2%? And is that different from Title I?
Yes, it is different. It's different by program. Each program has a different administrative cost cap. So Title I has a 15%, and Title I actually has no federal cap. This is a state legislation. So it has a state cap of 15%, and that's on both direct administration and indirect. So that's one where you have to watch. If your indirect cost rates go way up, then you may not have enough money within that 15% to pay for your staff that administers the program. Title II has no legislative cap. However, CDE uses the 15% reasonableness as kind of a rule of thumb. Title III, EL has a 2% cap, but on direct administrative costs, you can apply your full indirect cost rate to the remainder. Okay. Title III immigrant has no legislative indirect cost. However, CDE applies a reasonableness rule in this case at 2% for direct administration, allowing full application. of your indirect costs. And Title IV has a 2% direct administrative cost rate. So yeah, they're all over the place and they're all different depending on the legislation.
Difficult to keep straight in the head.
Yeah. Hopefully, as you go through the application, they kind of make it clear to you there. But in day-to-day work, it's harder.
Yeah.
As you start, implementing your program, it's hard to keep those in your head.
A couple more in that area there. Can the direct cost be 0 if the LEA hasn't spent money on direct administration, or does it have to have an amount?
That's an interesting question, and we will follow up on that because, should have asked it before. I knew one of you would come up with it, because there's no requirement, to my knowledge, that you must charge direct administrative costs, and yet on some of the program pages it says it cannot be 0. So thank you for asking that. We will follow up and see if we can get clarity on that.
Okay. Is there a list of how LEAs are using their direct administrative costs?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, usually it's district level program administrators, because your school level money should be for direct services. So it's usually district administration, people that do, the ConApp does some of those pieces. So no, there's generally not a list of costs, but it usually is district level administrative support that supports specifically the program. So.
And as a follow-up to the conversation on the differences in the different titles, someone commented, I thought Title III English learners had a 2% indirect and direct cost. When did the indirect cost change?
Under ESSA, that's when it changed. It used to be, you're absolutely right. Someone out there's been around a while, okay? Because that's absolutely correct. It used to be 2% for both direct and indirect costs. Your whole administrative cap was 2% under ESSA, and that's where that word, and somebody, and I think it was in the ConApp workshop, well, wait a minute, that's changed. And it said direct administration. So they split it out just because they added the word direct, whereas before it just said administrative. So it changed in 2015, 16, I guess, 15 ESSA passed. So it changed back then. It's been about 4 years, 5 years.
Okay, let's see. Is there a deadline for filing a waiver for Title I carryover?
The waiver is, you're submitting it in this submission of the consolidated application. This is when the deadline is February 28th. Now, and then it's, but, right. And for this year, CDE, typically they can only approve a waiver once every 3 years. This year, the federal waiver allowed them to approve a waiver, even though you've had one. But you apply for it in the ConApp. We'll take a look at where that is in a little bit. And then once you apply for it, then CDE will notify you that you're approved for the carryover. It's kind of scary because it's always after the fact. Like, the money was supposed to be spent by September 30th, and you don't know if you get the waiver until now. So it's a cross your fingers, but usually if you have a good description of how you're going to use it, usually those are approved if you're eligible.
Okay. And related to waivers, a question just came in. Do waivers still have to report to board?
Well, it depends on what the waiver's for. In the ConApp, this doesn't require board approval, but it's a CDE waiver. If it's a local waiver, then yes, you would have to go to your board. Like there's some Title I we'll look at in a few other slides, but it kind of depends on what the waiver is. Yeah. But for Title I carryover, it's in your ConApp. So there's no board approval for this submission of the ConApp. It's in the winter submission. So based on that, not aware of any requirement because the board isn't approving the waiver, CDE is approving the waiver.
Thank you. Should we move on? There's a couple questions coming in, but I think we can answer them. Okay. Yeah,
let's go on because 2021 gets heavy. And some of these will come up in later slides, so hopefully they'll make sense. Okay. All right, so now we're going to take a look at 1920 money. Okay, that's money that came available on July 1, 2019. And remember, these are the funds that currently, unless we get a blessing from the feds, these are scheduled to expire on September 30th, 2021. So that's next September. So keep your eye on these funds. And speaking of carryover, that's our first slide, is about carryover. So Title I carryover, again, you have carryover this year. Remember, the first year for Title I, you can only carry over 15%. So you have to spend 85% of your Title I funds in the first year. It's the only program that has that restriction, okay? And so this year, two possible boxes will appear. One of them would be for those LEAs that exceeded the 15% last year. Okay, so if you exceeded 15%, that would be one box, and that's where you have to apply for the waiver. And the second is if there is no carryover, the carryover is not applicable, and that would be for an LEA that received under $50,000. So that carryover limit doesn't apply to you, or if you don't have carryover over 15%. So one of those two boxes will appear, and here's what the carryover page looks like. So again, you have your, that should say 1920 allocation. So correct that on your slide there. 1920 allocation plus any transfers in. So if last year you transferred money into Title I, it will be included there. And then that will end up to be your total allocation amount. Then you're going to enter all your expenditures and obligations through September 30th, 2020. And what will pop up is a carryover amount and percentage. Okay. Then if that exceeds 15%, the response box will appear. And that response box asks you to describe how you plan to use the carryover funds. So how do you plan to use them in the coming year? CD essentially is saying, we want to make sure you're going to spend these. Then CDE can approve that waiver for you. And if they, in the past, if you had a waiver in the last 3 years, CDE would not have been able to approve it. They would have said, I'm sorry, you already had a waiver. We don't have authority. But the flexibility waiver allows them this year to approve that carryover waiver for you. So, but again, you're not approved until you hear from them that you've got approval of the carryover waiver. And you just write, and it's a brief, I think you're limited to 1,000 characters in there, but you need to describe how you plan to spend those funds. So you need to convince them you're going to spend them by the end of this year. Okay, so that's a carryover. So the question came up, but how do I apply, and is there a deadline? This is it. This is how you apply for the carryover waiver. And that's why if you have the board approval is not, it's CDE approving it. So it's part of the application. Okay. So if you want to take it to the board, that's fine, but no requirement. All right. So the next page just shows if you don't have carryover or if you're under 50,000, then it will stop there. No box, nothing else to report. So it'll be a simpler submission. All right. So let's, just because you hope that you're under the 15%, it's easier. Let's look at what that means. This is a question often comes up. Well, what does it mean that I spent the funds? So let's look at the next slide about obligations. And the obligations mean that that the funds are obligated to be spent. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily mean that the check's been written. And the Education Department General Administration has specific timelines depending on the type of cost or expenditure it is. And this is a section in the Code of Federal Regulations that you need to look at for federal funds. So on the next page, we'll see a chart, the first part of a chart. And this is, it's nice little chart in the code. And when you're determining expenditures for calculating your carryover, this chart can be helpful to determine what you can count. So if you look at the first two, services by an employee versus services by a contractor. So services by an employee, the obligation date is the date the services were performed. So when did the employee perform the services? That counts as an obligation, not necessarily the pay date. Services by a contractor would be when you make a binding written commitment for the services for work or for whatever the contract is for. So on the date the services were obligated, meaning you have a contract, you have to pay it. And if there's not a written commitment, then it would be on the date that the services were received. But in most cases, you have a contract. That contract means you have to pay it, and that's the date when you obligate the funds. And that's different from, we always put travel. And that's probably a non-issue this year, so maybe not a big deal, but maybe there was some travel. But travel is only, you can only obligate it on the date the travel's taken. So you pay for reservations ahead, you pay for the plane ticket, but you can't count that until the travel's taken, which is different than a contractor where you have a binding agreement to provide the services. Okay. All right, next slide, I think goes over some of the other acquisition of supplies and equipment. You'll notice that's similar to a contractor. On the date you make a binding written commitment. So you put the order in, you have a commitment to pay it, and in the near future though. And what does that mean? And CSAM, just so you know, on the next slide, the California School Accounting Manual kind of reinforces this, that you can count something in a current year as paid if it meets the federal obligation requirements. Okay? However, you can't just make a commitment and say, we'll pay this sometime in the next 5 years. Okay, it's got to be liquidated, and that's the next slide. Okay, so liquidation means that is when you write the check, the money goes out the door. So once you've made the obligation, you have to liquidate the funds not later than 90 days after the end of the period of performance. So you have 90 days, so you have a little bit of grace time. So think about if you're coming close to the carryover, although this year is not a major issue for you because CDE has the authority to grant a waiver, but always good if you can show that you've spent the funds in the current year. So obligation, check the chart, liquidation, get it paid within 90 days. Okay. All right, the next page. So that's all about carryover. Next page is your Title III English Learner Report. And this you're reporting, and this is 1920, so you're reporting expenditures from July 1 of 2019 through this past December. Okay, so it's an 18-month report. Remember I said that Title III programs, you have more frequent reporting in many cases. Here again, we see a 2% maximum for direct administrative costs, including anything that's transferred in. So you will receive an error message on this page if you submit, if your direct administrative costs are above 2%. And you'll notice on this page, there are two lines. There's direct administrative costs, and then there's an indirect cost line. And so it's the direct administrative cost that could cause you an error message. The approved indirect cost rate is your indirect cost rate applied to the remainder of the funds not used for direct administration. So you're going to enter those expenditures by general object code areas there. The next one is going to be very similar, English Learner Report. It's an 18-month report. So from July 1, 2019 through last December 31st. And this is different, you notice. It's a warning message, not an error message. because there's no legislative cap on direct administration, but CDE, using the reasonableness test, says they recommend you should not exceed 2%. Okay, and your approved indirect cost rate can be applied to the rest. So this, you might get a call from Title III office saying, tell me about what you're doing with that administrative, why you're exceeding 2%. So no, it's a warning. You can certify. EL, you can't certify. And again, you're just reporting by object code and your administrative costs by direct and indirect. That's Title III. And I think that's the end of 1920. Okay, so 1819, 1920, just a few reports on it, but 2021 is where so I think we'll forge ahead for 2021 because this one can take a while. So the first, this is current year. So this is what your reporting is for this year. So 2021 funds. The first page has to do with federal transferability. Okay? Federal transferability is allowed under Title V, Part A. So, and it's not to be confused. I don't think we have any districts that get the alternative use of funds or REAP funds. Those are usually small rural districts. That's also under Title V, but it's Part B. Part A is federal transferability. Again, a change under ESSA. You can now transfer up to 100% of Title II or Title IV funds into other allowable ESSA programs. In the past, there was a limit on how much you could transfer. Now you can transfer up to 100%. However, as many of you learned through the addendum, although you can transfer the fund, LEAs are still required to meet the requirements for Title II and Title IV as a condition of receipt of funds. In other words, feds are saying, you're taking the money and you took the money for these professional development and other areas allowed under Title II, for the allowable areas under Title IV. You said that's what you wanted the money for. You can transfer the money, but you still need to meet the requirements on your own dime. Okay. So many of you found that when you wrote the addendums, you said, but I transferred the money. And they said, sorry, you have to complete the addendum anyway. So just keep that in mind. Transfer the funds doesn't transfer the responsibility. The funds that are transferred, however, become subject to the requirements of the program to which they're transferred. So if you transfer funds from Title IV to Title I, then the Title I rules apply, and those include the equitable services requirements. So that's going to increase your equitable share under the program to which the funds are transferred. One thing to keep in mind when if you're transferred, and hopefully this again is a decision you should have made, your reporting, but just to remember, transferability only allows you to transfer funds from a less restrictive program to a more restrictive program. So make sure that's what you want to do, okay? Because you cannot transfer funds out of Title I or Title III. And think about those programs. Title II, a lot of things you can do under Title II, fairly, professional development, teacher support, a lot of administrative support for professional development. Title IV, you have those allowable areas, and this year even more flexible. They eliminated the percentages, so those are pretty flexible programs. Allow you to do a lot of creative things. Title I, more restrictive, school level funds, school plans. Title III, even more restrictive, has to supplement state and local and federal funds. So it sounds great. We can transfer all the money, but make sure you have a plan for what you're going to do with those transferred funds. Just a little caution there, but you can transfer it and you do it on the next page. And so what you're going to find on that page is you're going to see all your Title II funds, and you're going to see the amount you have in Title II. You're going to see the amount you have in Title IV, and then you have all the eligible programs listed there. So you can see there's Title I Part A. You could put migrant, delinquent in your EL programs, and you can move it between Title II and Title IV. You can switch it between those two programs. Again, you indicate the amount transferred if you choose to transfer. And question also, can you it, yes, you can split it among multiple programs. You don't have to put it on one program. You can put a little in multiple programs if you wish. Okay? Again, can't transfer anything out of 1 or 3. You can transfer among 2 and 4 and into any of those programs. You will get an error message if you try transferring money into a program you're not participating in. So if you don't take Title III funds, then you can't transfer into Title III. Okay? You can only if you have to take the money and in the current year. So whatever programs you're participating in, those are the ones you could transfer to. This page is important in terms of what we talked about, data dependency, because if you transfer, you can see there's a lot of possible data dependency issues. Because once you fill this in, the amounts you indicate are going to pop over into those other pages and into your Title II and IV reporting pages. So the changes you make here, you're going to see show up later on other pages. And if you have a problem on the other pages, you may have to come back and fix something here. So keep that in mind, that this page, it's all going to pop over to other pages and you're going to see transfers in showing up. All right. Okay, and nonprofit private school. Okay, we're going to be hitting a lot of private school data collections, and these are just challenging, just in terms of, going back and forth. Fortunately, Sylvia Hannah holds my hand through these, but so just some general, before we go, we're just going to look at Title I first, but just some general things to keep in mind about all the private school data collections, and little warnings and suggestions on the various pages. First of all, the private schools displayed on all of the pages are from your spring nonprofit private school consultation form. Okay. So last spring, you completed a consultation form and you had to indicate, did you consult with the schools? Was an affirmation signed? And in the past, all the reporting, you had to report on numbers and which schools are participating, and that was pulled out and moved to this winter reporting, which is another reason why it's longer. So all the information, if you say, where'd that school come from? Well, it's what you reported last spring. Only schools with a written affirmation on file are included, okay? So did you indicate that they had an affirmation, and are they listed on the CDE list? Okay. CDE has a disclaimer on there that the enrollment numbers are not verified by CDE. Private schools report them, but they say LEAs are expected to verify those enrollment numbers. Okay. You'll find that on every one of the pages, that these are self-reported and they don't verify them. They expect you. And that's important for many of the programs because funding is based on enrollment. So if those enrollment numbers don't seem appropriate, you need to ask for documentation. Okay. Then they remind you that you need to maintain written affirmation of consultation, and they suggest the following, that you should have documentation of the dates of all the contacts, the persons who were contacted, the results of the consultation, and this applies to both those that are participating and those that chose not to participate. So documentation is extremely important for private school equitable services. So this applies to all the private school pages. So the first page is going to be for Title I. And this is going to be your private school low income count. Okay. And you won't see this if you're a charter school or county office, or if you didn't apply for Title I. So you'll only see this collection if you have eligible schools. Again, the schools listed here are all going to be from the private school consultation page. There's a section that says schools added, and that is if you added a school on that spring form that is outside your attendance area. For Title I, you may be serving schools outside your district attendance area because you may have eligible students there. And if it says a school added, then that means this is an outside your attendance area school that you added on. You indicate if the school is participating, yes or no. So you can check that box. Then you're going to indicate the number of low income students. Okay. And remember, you have multiple ways to determine your low income students. This should have been from last year, but preferable method, according to the U.S. Department, is that it be the same measure that the district uses, which would be free and reduced. So if they have that, then you can use that. You can use an alternative income form that shows that that goes to families and looks and is comparable to what free and reduced lunch eligibility would be. Some schools have other documentation, such as scholarship programs, but you need to consult with them and get those low income numbers. And that should have happened because it's February. So hopefully you have those numbers, but those are the things you'll be doing. And then you'll get an error message if you've already certified, because this page connects to your Title I allocations and reservation page. So that's why you do the pages in order. If you jumped ahead and certified that page, you'll probably get an error message saying you need to make sure these two pages match. There is, if you have a lot of private schools, there's a downloadable Excel file that you can use to collect them, to populate the data and then pop it back in here. Okay. All right, so next is, and up at the top, you can see I mentioned earlier, we put the instructions up at the top there. All right, so this is the Title I, again, Title I Part A school student counts page. And on this page, you're going to, first of all, this is how you're going to start your ranking and allocating funds to schools. So this is an important page. You need to have made some decisions that will be reflected here. The first you're going to decide is whether you want to rank your schools district-wide or by grade span. Okay. So you have an option. You can take all your schools and put them in a row, and then you'll rank them by poverty, your highest poverty first, and you can do that district-wide, all of them in a row. Or if you want to focus on a particular grade span, you can say, no, I want to do it by grade span, and they will rank all your elementary and your middle and your high schools separately. Okay. There's a link in the instructions for grade span assignments. If you have some odd or different grade span groupings, typically it's elementary, middle, high, but sometimes, yeah, K8, K9. So you need to check and see how your schools are designated on that link if you have some interesting school configurations. If you use a composite, then it's going to ask for your low income measure. And that means, are you going to use free and reduced lunch, or are you going to use something else? There's something called a composite measure, which means you're looking at multiple measures, but you need a comment required if you're going to use multiple measures. But there's a drop down that allows you to select different options, a feeder pattern, free and reduced, or other low income data. Most everyone uses free and reduced lunch data. Enrollment and your low income count are pre-populated on this page, and this is a bit of a change. Whoops, there's a blank there. I didn't get that report. Evan knows. Enrollment and low income count are pre-populated with your prior year's certified CalPADS data, and what it's going to give you pre-populated here are your enrollment in your low income numbers for students age 5 through 17, and that's going to automatically come from the CalPADS data. The difference from this year is that they're using prior year's data, so that's your 2019 fall report. The reason for that is you should be ranking your schools in the spring. Okay? So when you are doing your spring ConApp and you know you have money available, you should be figuring out which schools are you going to serve, and that money should be getting out to schools. Now is not the time to tell schools they're funded for the year. So waiting for this period, waiting for now is too late. And your CalPADS data wouldn't be certified till now. So they're going to put the prior year, but you do have the option to use either current or prior year. So if current year better reflects the poverty levels in your schools, then you need to go to the CalPADS report with the low-income students aged 5 through 17. And Rena DeRose is the page contact here, and she'd be happy to walk you through that. But you can change it to current year if that better reflects your student population. But it should be, how did you allocate, how did you determine which schools are going to be funded, okay? Again, if you didn't apply for Title I, you won't you won't get this page. And if you have grade level changes, you have to put them in Opus. So this is going to, key things on this page: what's your low income measure, how are you going to rank your schools, and the numbers on this page are going to pop over into your school allocation page. And I saw a question about CEP, and we will answer that in the Q&A. That's a whole other world. Thank you for asking, though. All right, next slide. Okay. The next page is, again, Title I, Private School Equitable Services Reservations. This one has data dependency all over the place, okay? It has data dependency with your Title I Private School Low Income Count page that you did, that we just did a couple of pages ago, and also your allocations and reservations page and your school allocation page. So this one's a little challenging to figure out, but it sort of does make sense when you get there, all right? Your low income private school count on this page is going to be pre-populated from that count we did a couple slides ago, the private school low income count page. So let's take a look at this page. It's a doozy. Okay. All right. So the steps to completing the page are first, the instructions say that you take your total low income count and you just add 1 to it as a placeholder. All right. And then you save that page, and you're going to exit the page. That's all you do. And then you're going to go to your LEA allocation and reservation page and complete everything that's required on that page, because that's where you're going to find your funding amount that's available. And you can't figure your allocations until you figure the funding amount. Save and exit that page. Then you have to go to your school allocations form and calculate the number of public school low income students in your participating Title I schools. So you can't do that until you rank your schools. Right. So the system is going to, will do automatically, once all that information is there, this page will automatically calculate the equitable share, the minimum parent engagement for private school reservations. That will automatically be calculated, but it takes 3 different pages to get there. So if we look at the next slide, I hope is a screenshot of that page. There it is. Okay. So you're, again, we said a lot of data dependencies, but you're going to have your low income private school will be pre-populated from the page you did, your Title I's private school count. That number will populate here, but you can't get a count of your public and private schools until you go and identify your Title I schools on the school allocation page. So that's why they're saying add 1 as a placeholder and close the page and then move up, okay? And then at the bottom, you can also, under the equitable share, you can apply administrative costs and indirect to the amount allocated for services for equitable service, and exceed 15% of the proportionate share for both indirect and admin, as with other Title I programs. So the next slide shows I think, the intersect of all these pages. So again, you first have your Title I private school equitable services, the page we just had. You're going to add 1 to that collection. Step 2, you go to your LEA allocations and reservation page, which we haven't gotten to yet, but all the fields with an asterisk, fill it out. That will give you the funding amount available. Then step 3, you go to your school allocation page, and you're going to have to do your ranking and determine which are eligible schools, calculate your total public school numbers, and then you're going to go back to the form and add public and private numbers together so you can come up with a percentage. So hold your breath as you do those. It's a challenging page there. All right, next page is this is your allocation and reservation page. All right, and this there's there's a separate page now, and I think it's just applicable to charters, but there is a reservation for neglected students, and that will not show up if your LEA is not required to reserve those funds. Okay, let's take a look at the next one though, which is for, oops, no, back up. Sorry, it's not there. I thought it was. Go 2 forward, could you, and see if where that one showed up. Yeah. Nope, back up. All right, we're going too fast. All right. So on this page again, it's going to show your total entitlement. You're going to include any transfers in from that federal transferability page you did a few pages back. Remember, you listed, or if you put any Title II or IV funds in here, that will show up here. And then you can't do the equitable share yet because that's on the prior page. Your required reservations, parent and family engagement. It will automatically calculate for you and it will put, you have to reserve at least 1% for parent engagement. It will calculate the 1%. It will also calculate the school amount at 90% and the LEA amount at the remaining 10%. You can change those numbers, but you have to have at least 1% total, and at least 90% of the 1% has to go to schools. So it'll give you a baseline. You can exceed that, but as long as you work within those rules. And then you have a reservation for homeless youth, and that's a required reservation. And then you have authorized reservations, and authorized reservations are for school level direct services to students at Title I schools. Okay, so they're district operated services, but they're only for Title I schools. So it's not a district-wide activity. That's sometimes confusing. They say they're district-wide. They're not district-wide. They're at Title I schools only, unless all your schools are Title I. And you can reserve funds off the top because these funds reduce the amount of funds available to your schools. Because when you do your school level allocations, that comes after you've deducted any reservations. So because of that, because that's going to reduce it, you should consult with your schools to make sure that they're okay with that, they're comfortable, they know what services they'll be getting. And the Fiscal Monitoring Office has indicated they would expect to see those activities reflected in Title I school plans because they take place at Title I schools. Then you're going to have a reservation summary at the bottom showing your LEA required and allowable reservations. And it will show at the bottom the amount available for allocation to schools. All right. And we get questions frequently about services for homeless youth and the reservation. There is no required amount except that you must reserve funds for reservations for homeless students. This is a little bit of a question. Homeless, these are for students who at any school. So it can be for students who are at non-Title I schools. It could be for additional services to students at Title I schools for services you wouldn't typically provide that are more based on the needs of homeless youth. So identifying homeless students, how do you determine the amount? You might have just based on numbers. we know how many students we have, and we're going to come up with a per pupil. You could multiply that by your Title I per pupil amount that you're allocating to schools. You could, if you have McKinney-Vento, you could reserve an amount that's similar to your McKinney-Vento grant. You can reserve a percentage based on your poverty count. You could say, well, our poverty count is this, our homeless probably is this amount. We also suggest that you consult with your homeless liaison. Your homeless liaison should be able to tell you about what are the needs of those students. And oftentimes what we hear is homeless liaisons have no idea how much is being reserved, how they have access to it, and they should definitely be a part of that conversation. So talk to your homeless liaison and they can probably give you some help on what's a reasonable amount to reserve for services for those students. So the next data collection, we're still on Title I, right? And this is your school allocation page, okay? And the low income measure and the ranking option that you chose several pages ago on the school student counts page is going to show up here. And that's how they will be ranking your schools. So the enrollment and the low income and numbers from age 5 through 17 will be pre-populated from the school student counts page. And the schools will be automatically ranked based on what ranking option you chose, district-wide or by grade span. A school is marked eligible if it's at or above the district poverty average. If a school is marked eligible, it doesn't mean they have to be funded. It means they're eligible to be funded. And there's some decisions you need to make about which schools would be funded. If a school is marked required to be served, that means it's over 75% poverty and it must be funded, because all schools over 75% must be funded. Also, for high schools, any high school under ESSA change, under any high school under ESSA that is over 50% poverty may be served ahead of other schools. So that would be your low income. When you determine how much is going to be allocated to each school, most schools use this, most LEAs use the same per pupil amount for all their schools. However, you can vary it, but you, as long as you provide a higher per pupil amount to your higher poverty schools. You can't fund a lower poverty school at a higher amount than a school with a higher poverty level. Okay, that's kind of the rule. CDE has a great website. If you put school-wide for ranking, if you look at it, it's called the School Allocations webpage, and extremely helpful to how to rank the schools. There are some discretion codes up at the top, and those discretion codes allow you to serve a school that is marked ineligible under certain conditions. And so the first one is A, if a school below the district poverty rate, but it's over 35% poverty, okay, that can be solved. If it's under a desegregation waiver, that's an exception. Another one, and we've had a question on this, is a grandfather provision. If you have a school that was served last year, it was eligible last year, and it fell out of ranking because it fell below the eligibility level and showing as not eligible, you can grandfather it for 1 year, so you could continue serving it. You probably have been serving it this year under the grandfather provision, but you need to mark it, and E is the grandfather provision. And F is a feeder pattern. That means that the school may not show it's eligible here, but you have data, and you'll need to hold on to that data to show that you have this is for middle and high schools generally, that the kids who feed into that school based on the patterns, which students go to which school, that you can show that elementary schools have a poverty rate leads to those schools meeting the eligibility percentage. This is because a lot of times high school students they don't apply for free and reduced lunch. And so your numbers might be lower at the high school, but you may know, no, I know those students and they're from these schools. And so you can maintain that data. Okay. Data dependency, again, a lot of this came from the school student counts page. And you'll get an error message if you try funding a school that says it's not eligible, but and there's no discretion code. Okay, so let's look at, and then how does that look? Okay. All right, so this is just another view of the same. You'll see all those stars there. That's all the data that's going to pop over onto this page. So you can see a lot of it's going to be pre-populated for you. And then down at the bottom, you'll see there's an equitable services. This is a check on your equitable services page. So these numbers will show up, and they need to show a 0 at the bottom to show that you've done your equitable services correctly. All right, so next slide, I think, shows that. Yeah, so it shows it'll show your total participating public and private school students, your Title I public school low income count, and then your private school low income count, and the sum of Title I public and private school low income plus the sum of your public school low income plus the sum of your private school low income minus your total public and private. That should all come out to 0 if you do the math on that one. So this is just a check on your other pages, and this will all be automatically populated. All right, next page, I hope, is going to be, all right, is your, again, Title I school out. Oh, this is the form that will show if you're a single school district or you have less than 1,000 students. And for those schools, CDE does not enforce the ranking rules because you're not required. You only have one school, but you still have to submit the page. So this is the page that it'll look like. It's just a simpler page if you're a single school district or you have fewer than 1,000 students. That's a lot of our charters will get this page. So let's look again at the ranking. Let's go through it a little bit more. Basic ranking rules. And again, go to the CD website. They've done a great job on that page. So first of all, you must fund all your schools over 75% poverty. So no matter if you rank by grade span, if you rank district-wide, doesn't matter. New under ESSA, you may serve high schools over 50% poverty before you can push them ahead of other schools like your 75% schools. And then after serving those schools, then you rank either on a district-wide or a grade span basis, whatever you indicated. And a school may be eligible if it's at or above the district poverty level. Okay. And again, we said a school may be served. And when I mentioned before, you don't have to serve a school because it's eligible, because funding must be sufficient to provide a viable program with a likelihood of success. So we know some LEAs want to just sprinkle a little Title I money all over the place. That's not the purpose of Title I. The whole formula and the whole ranking process is designed to push the money to your highest poverty schools. You can see it's 75% poverty first, then rank them in order of poverty. So sprinkling money a little bit here and there does not lead to a good program for students. And so you really need to think, where are you going to cut that so schools get enough money to operate a good program, particularly if you're looking at a school-wide program. You can't do that with a little bit of money. So it's not just, this isn't just play money that we just give a little to everyone. It's there for a purpose based on a plan, and it needs to be enough to provide a good program. So then as schools marked eligible on the next page, if it's at or above the poverty level, and if you can fund a school that doesn't meet that, if it meets what a 35% low income requirement. But it's below the district poverty average. So you can fund a school down to 35%, but it's going to show it's not eligible, because eligible means at or above the district poverty level. But the law allows you to serve a school down to 35%, but it's an exception. And again, desegregation waivers not usually used. Grandfather provision, you fund an ineligible school for 1 extra year. Kind of the idea there is if you have changing demographics, it gives you a year to ease that school out of Title I. And then you have the feeder pattern. And then if you fund any school, so this is for districts that you may have a school that is below 35% poverty, but your district poverty average is below 35%. In that case, it's going to show as an eligible school. But if you fund it, you have to fund it at 125% of your total allocation. So, and I would suggest you that's hard to do, but basically it means you pull a lot of your money for administration out and put it into the school funding. All right, you can't skip, next page, you can't skip a higher poverty school to fund a lower ranked school. And again, that's because we're pushing money to your highest poverty schools. You can use different per pupil amounts, but you can't fund a lower poverty school at a higher rate. So on the next page, we'll look at a little quiz here, and this kind of shows a sample for a district. And we'll just look at some of those quickly because we're getting close to time here. The next pages, fortunately, are pretty quickie. So we look Wilson School. This is a district with a 72.14% poverty, district-wide poverty level. Wilson School is required to be funded, and you notice Wilson, it's at 77+%, so it's over 75% poverty. Whereas Sycamore, it's eligible but not required, but you notice it's at 75%, it's not above 75%, so that was a trick question on that one. McKinley is not eligible. If you look at McKinley, this is a high poverty district. So it's 70% poverty at McKinley. It's still not eligible because it is below the district average. However, it's above 35%. You could make an exception and serve it. And Gridley and Esperanza are much lower poverty schools, the high schools, but because they're high schools, you can use the 50% poverty level and push them forward. So that's just a little example of what your ranking can look like. All right, let's hope the rest. Are we still on Title I? Oh, it's getting easier. This is notification of your school-wide authorization. This comes once a year. It has to be certified annually, even if you don't have any changes. You don't change the board approval date. It's the original board approval date. You can update the poverty percentage. If a school falls below 40% poverty, then you need to get a local waiver. And you can add any new schools. If you plan on adding schools through June 30th, you can include them in this form. But if they're not going to be, then you'll have to wait till next year. So this is essentially verifying, yes, these are our school-wide schools. You notice there's a local board approval date and there's a local approved waiver date. The waiver date must precede the board approval date. Essentially, the waiver is saying we as a board approve this school, even though it's below 40% poverty. We believe it meets the criteria, and we'll look at those in a minute, to be school-wide. We approve it. Now the school can begin the planning process, and that should be a year-long process. So then the board approves it once they have a plan. But they first have to form a school site council, develop a plan. So you have board approval of the waiver first, then board approval of the plan. All right. So the waiver on the next page is a two-step process. Step one, the board approves a waiver, and you have to meet one of these criteria. Okay. And so you can see there's multiple criteria. CSI school could qualify, 25% more low income, and even a board recommendation. We think this is the best way to operate for this school. On step two, once the board, on the next slide, once the board approves the waiver, then the school can begin the planning process, develop a school site council, and once the board approves the school-wide plan, the school can operate as a school-wide program. That's the board approval date that goes on there. All right, next one is Title I Part D. Again, this is county offices only, and this is just your 2021 allocations and expenditures. So big chunk of areas, any transferred in. This is just reporting what you're spending for the current year, and the counties only. The next one is Title II and III, your non-profit indicate which private schools are participating. Again, these schools popped over from your spring consultation form. You need to change that consultation form. Check with Sylvia Hanna. She said you contact the ConApp support desk and tell them you need to reopen that form if there are schools that you need to change here. You can't change them here, have to go back to the spring form. Schools are listed, and then the school added again, if that's a non-attendance area school. Okay, so this one is for unified districts. And then there is another form, I think that might pop up on the next slide. And in case two districts serve a school, like you have an elementary district and a high school district, and you have a K-12 private school. So if the two of you are both serving them, then you would fill out this form. It's very much similar, but each of you would indicate, and they'd probably be, schools would be possibly added, you might not have. All right, Title II, next page is allocations. This is just your Title II allocation. This includes this page. There are two different options for this page that you'll get. One is for LEAs operating Title 5B, which was called REAP. It's now called Alternative Use of Funds. So this is just all your Title II, you're transferred in, any funds transferred in, any funds transferred out. And then there's a place to add REAP. So let's look at the next slide. Most of you aren't REAP people, but what that means, this is funds for small rural schools. And there's one that's a federal grant, but there's also one that comes through the ConApp. That's these funds, and it can be used for any activities under Title I, 2, 3, or 4, or parent involvement. So if you use these funds for any of your REAP funds, if you're a REAP district, you put them in, you indicate how much of it's being used for Title II on this page. That doesn't apply to very many of you. Next is Title II. This is just your allocation for this year. Allocation at the top, any funds transferred in, any funds transferred out. Remember, Title II can go either way. You're going to include your reservation for equitable services. How much are you reserving? And again, administrative and indirect cost exceeding 15%. You'll get a warning, but no legal mandate. So Title III on the next page is, this one is allocations and reservations. So again, Title III, your allocation for this year, how much money was transferred in if you did, and then the total available. And then you're going to, in this case, you're listing your expenditures by allowable program areas. So those are all the things you can spend Title III funds on, and you'll get an error message. Again, Title III, if you exceed your 2% cap on direct administrative costs. Next slide. And this is Title III, your expenditure report from July 1. It's a 6-month. I told you Title III asks for a lot of expenditure reports. This is a 6-month report from last July 1 through December 30th. Includes any funds you transferred in from that transferability page. Again, your budgeted amounts by allowable areas and object codes, and an error message on direct administration over 2%. And next is Title III immigrant, very much the same. Again, any funds transferred in. This is include amounts budgeted for any for authorized. So it's just one amount. You're not breaking it down by object code here, and a warning message only for the 2% and reasonableness for direct administrative costs. Next is And by the way, this is being recorded, so you can, if you have to go, it will be posted very, very soon. Okay, where are we here? Title III immigrant 6-month expenditure report. Okay, that I think is pretty self-explanatory, just your expenditures for that period. Warning on 2% direct admin. Next is Title IV. This is your Title IV private school participation report. So you're reporting any private schools that are participating in Title IV. The schools popped over based on the spring school consultation form. You're going to indicate which are participating. And again, if there are any additional schools or any changes, it could impact how much you reserved on your allocations page. But this is just identify participating schools for Title IV for this year, 2020-21. And Title IV allocation is on the next page. And they're asking, and remember this year you had some flexibility in Title IV. You weren't stuck with those percentage areas for the 3 areas of service. So it's just going to show your allocation, funds transferred in or out from that transferability page, okay, because you can go either way with Title IV, an error message on your 2% cap on direct administrative costs, not including your indirect cost amount. There it is. Okay, I couldn't see the indirect cost. So again, 2% cap, and this is an error message, not a warning. You can't exceed 2% on Title IV. And then you're going to include the amount you're reserving for your equitable services based on the schools you identified on the previous page. And the last one, consolidation of administrative costs. This is where you apply if you wish to use the consolidated administrative cost option. You indicate the programs, you can consolidate. You can only, your administrative caps apply as they do to each program area. What this means is essentially it relieves some of the burden of time and effort reporting for administrators working on multiple federal programs. Two of the problems most districts find with it is, one, it only applies to federal programs. So while you could clump your federal programs together, if you're working on state programs, you're still going to have to do more frequent time reporting because you have 2 cost objectives. If you're only working on these federal programs, you could be considered a single cost objective and do semi-annual reporting. The other challenge is your fiscal office. Sometimes they're not really excited about this because what they have to do, they put it into, and on the next slide, I think it says, expenditures. Look, treat it as a single cost. Go to the next slide. This is from the CSAM. So you put all of the funds from those programs for administration are put in a single resource code. Then at the end of the year, you have to charge back to the individual programs. So sometimes your fiscal people say, I'd rather not be doing that at the end of the year. It's easier just to charge as we go. But it is something to consider. I would suggest talking to the department, a contact person there, if you're thinking of doing it, for pros and cons. As I say, I'm not aware of any, if any districts that are doing the consolidated admin, but think about it if you have a lot of administrators working only on federal programs and they hate doing time and effort. Okay, you'll find the CSAM is procedure 780, includes additional information. If you're interested, I'd take a look at that. All right, and deadline reminder, your February 28th is, you need to finish it up. As it approaches, sometimes the system gets clogged. I don't know if that's been happening lately, but the earlier you get it in, the better. As we said, sometimes the data collections remain open after the deadline for a while, but once they're closed, you have to request permission to reopen. So always best to get it done by that deadline. And then you're going to certify all your data collections. So you go back and make sure they're all certified and submitted, and you're done for a few months. And then we'll be back again in June to do it all over again with a new one. We are here. There's some resources on the next slide, and we are all here to support you as you have questions, as you work through that. Also, your CDE contacts are very helpful, and they're there to help you too. But again, sorry to rush through that last part, but we did too well in the first part, winner. So good luck and happy ConApping, and contact us if you have any questions. We'll leave the chat open for just a minute so you can add new questions into the chat.